Hello everyone, welcome to this seminar looking at why landlords should be renting to families on universal credit. We're looking at some research that's been done into some of the barriers to that in the minds of landlords and some of the practical ways we can overcome it. So I'm going to introduce you to the panelists and then we'll get cracking. So this seminar is sponsored by Capital Letters, which works with councils and landlords in London. Let me introduce the Chief Exec, Sue Coulson.
Hello.
We're joined by Ligia Teixeira, who is Chief Executive of the Centre for Homelessness Impact, who've done some research into giving landlords better access to tenants on universal credit. Bill Irvin is calling us from Scotland. He's an expert in universal credit and advises landlords and property interests. And Richard Blanco, who's the London representative of the National Residential Landlords Association and a landlord in his own right, so here to represent the landlord perspective. So we're going to run for about half an hour and then we'll have some actions at the end. I'm going to introduce Ligia to present the findings of some recent research she's done into landlord incentives to open up the PRS market to landlords such as yourselves. Ligia.
Thank you very much, Eddie, and thank you for bringing this group together to discuss such an important topic. For many people in receipt of benefits, accessing a tenancy in the private rented sector can be an uphill battle. Landlords, of course, hold the keys to the PRS, which is becoming an increasingly important part of the housing system. The decisions landlords make are vital. So even a small increase in the proportion of landlords willing to accept people on benefits housing availability and help to reduce levels of homelessness. That opportunity and others like it is why the Centre for Homelessness Impact joined forces with the National Residential Landlords Association and the Behavioural Insights teams to start testing the effectiveness of common interventions in this space. We know that taking an evidence-led approach to unlocking the private rented sector for people on benefits is just one way in which we can end homelessness sustainably. But by making sure more housing options are available to them, these trials will help us move towards an environment where both landlords and prospective tenants have their needs met. So what did we do? The centerpiece of the research was an online trial involving more than 2,700 landlords from across England and Wales. Each participant was asked about different scenarios to understand how they would react and respond across two broad areas. First, whether disclosing additional information about the tenant has any impact on increasing landlord willingness to continue with the application of someone receiving universal credit. And second, which local authority incentives or support programs are most effective at increasing landlord willingness to rent to someone receiving UC, including 1,000 cash upfront payment upon signing a tenancy agreement, rent guarantee, so a written guarantee from a local authority that it will cover late or unpaid rent, a deposit bond, so a cash amount equivalent to 1 month's rent, set aside to cover any costs a landlord might incur during the course of a tenancy, or support from a landlord liaison officer, so a dedicated resource that acts as a single point of contact for private landlords who need support with the tenancy. So what did we find? The study shows that rent guarantees and upfront cash payments from local authorities are most effective in opening up the private rented sector for people receiving benefits. These approaches had the greatest positive impact on landlords' openness to renting to this group. Offering a deposit bond or a liaison officer resulted in increases of less than half at large. However, and this is a big however, the overall willingness of landlords to rent to those in receipt of benefits nevertheless remained relatively low, even with the strongest interventions. So highlighting the need for policy changes to be made to drive change. So for many years, as you know, rising rents and shortages of affordable housing have put pressure on large numbers of families, significantly increasing housing vulnerability, especially for those receiving benefits. This has been compounded by the increase in universal credit claimants as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, of course. Recent government figures show a doubling from 3 million people in March 2020 to 6 million people today, which has made finding solutions that work for both tenants and private landlords all the more urgent. So one thing is clear in all of this: the private rented sector can play a valuable role in providing longer-term accommodation for those on benefits and or at risk of homelessness. It's vital that policymakers and practitioners heed the findings of this research to engage with landlords even more effectively and ensure that they are confident that any risks they perceive will be addressed. As the research shows, the central element for landlords is continued rent payments. Government holds the key to this through continuing to link local housing allowance to market rents, by improving the administration of universal credit and better use of guaranteed rent schemes at local level. Without taking these vital steps, evidence certainly suggests that it won't be possible to tackle homelessness more effectively. Thank you.
Thanks so much for those opening remarks, Ligia. That's really set the scene. And I think the real takeaway is for landlords listening is the number of potential tenants out there claiming benefits has increased. So there's an opportunity potentially there too. So Sue, could I ask you to unmute and bring you in to explain what Capital Letters does and draw on your experience of operating in this market to reflect on the research findings from the Centre for Homelessness Impact?
Thanks, Eddie. Yeah, we found the research really valuable and insightful in terms of us understanding landlords and their attitudes to renting to people who are homeless or threatened with homelessness. And certainly Capital Letters was set up in part as a response to the sorts of issues that the Centre for Homeless Impact researchers evidence. And our experience also reflects the insights that have been identified, particularly landlords' concern about letting to tenants who are on benefits because of the perceived lack of security of the income stream, which is clearly a big issue. So, and also, if they're not familiar with the benefit system themselves, then understanding that there are ways around it is important. So our role really is to act as an intermediary and de-risk the tenancies so that landlords can be confident in letting properties to homeless households by coming through Capital Letters. We're different in that we are here both for landlords and for tenants. Our objective is to ensure that tenancies are successful. We've been set up to help relieve homelessness in London. There is no benefit for our tenants if they become homeless again because they've been unable to pay their rent. So our job is absolutely enabling tenants to sustain their tenancies. But at the same time, we're very much there as a support service for landlords also, so that throughout the tenancy, they have an advocate on their behalf and that we can work with them. We can also navigate through the relationship with DWP to ensure that rent and claims are made on behalf of tenants. We support the tenants to make sure they do make the claims that they're entitled to. We also put a lot of effort in claiming backdated benefits they may have missed claiming for to ensure that any arrears are cleared. We're also there to make sure tenants understand their responsibilities as a tenant. It's possible that it might be the first tenancy or tenancy have failed before because they haven't understood their responsibilities. We act as an advocate for the landlord as well as the tenants. We ensure that the tenants behave. So if there's any repair issues, that they actually take responsibility for those. So the landlord's property and investment, therefore, is also protected as well as the income stream. We also offer incentive payments to landlords, which is in effect rent in advance, and we're looking to how we package that so landlords understand that they have a month's rent in advance that gives them that guarantee and security. But also it's good for the tenant that as they perhaps move on to other accommodation, they have that lump sum to take with them then as well as some sort of stepping stone to a future life. We very much work with tenants to enable them to think about what they do differently in the future to avoid homelessness, maybe getting to training and employment. So it's part of a journey for them. But to enable that to be successful, we need more landlords who are prepared to let their properties to the tenants that we are supporting. And so we want to work with landlords. And as I said, the research is really helpful to understand where the concerns lie, so that we can address those for you and give you the comfort that we're there for you as landlords as well as the tenants. Also, the more sustainable the tenancies are, the longer the tenant will stay with you, the less likely you are going to have void costs and the like whilst you try to find a new tenant. So if you triangulate the relationship, it's very much about enabling everybody to win out of this relationship. So I think that's probably all I'd like to say at this point, and perhaps we can have a conversation about the issues I've raised later on down the line.
Thanks very much, Sue. That's really set the scene nicely. Positioned Capital Letters as hopefully a partner between councils, landlords, and the benefit system. And ultimately, the money that pays landlords is coming from the benefit system. And so navigating that, I think Bill will confirm, is not necessarily straightforward, but hopefully reassure landlords out there that it is possible, and that once payments are flowing, it is a steady stream of rental income that they can rely on. So Bill, could you just reflect on the findings of the research that you've just heard from Leisure, and think about from a landlord perspective how they should be thinking about responding?
Good morning, everyone. I mean, I would support everything that Lygia has actually said. It makes sense. Trying to give landlords some certainty. Certainty of the rent is a big issue. At the moment, there's a lot of uncertainty, mainly because Universal Credit's system that is designed to prevent arrears from accruing is not working the way it should. And that's partly down to the fact that COVID has, as Sue said, doubled the numbers from 3 to 6 million within a matter of months. And because of that, some of the staff within DWP have moved to working from home using temporary systems. So the communication is not that great. The biggest complaints that I receive from landlords is the fact that they are waiting 2 or 3 months before they actually receive payment. And even when they receive payment, sometimes what happens is the payment then stops all of a sudden without any warning, without any notification. And communicating with DWP is difficult for landlords because landlords are not their client. Their client is the claimant. And there's barriers to entry as far as landlords are concerned. There is no dedicated email address for a landlord to notify a change in circumstances, even though they're legally obliged to do that. There is no dedicated phone number for them to phone, or if you phone the 0800 number that's actually provided, you'll wait 30 or 40 minutes to get through, only to be told we can't speak to you without the consent of a tenant. A tenant who may well be delinquent has run up thousands of pounds of rent arrears. Now, the type of approach that Capital Letters is taking is actually very similar to what housing associations do. They have staff within the organisation that support tenants through that process, welfare rights workers, money advice, financial inclusion staff. And their job is basically to make sure that where problems occur, they're there to step in, and knowing how to do that is very important. And landlords who want to engage in this end of the business, this niche market, my advice has always been, get to know as much about the system as you possibly can, find out where the problems lie, and find a way of resolving that either yourself or by engaging someone who can actually do that on your behalf. And the type of approach that Sue was talking about there is exactly what I would recommend. Because you want the tenancy not only to start right, but you want it to be sustained for a period of time. Chopping and starting tenancies is of no interest, or certainly is not something that as a landlord or investor you would want to see, because that's where rent arrears occurs. And it's now very difficult because of the ban on evictions and the length of time it's taken for court and the pre-action protocols that were introduced. It's very difficult for the landlord to try and resolve things through the court process. The APA scheme, the Alternative Payment Arrangement Scheme, or sometimes referred to as Direct Payment Scheme, has to be addressed. The DWP are basically saying that everything's hunky-dory. But in the last few days, they've announced that in the 2021 year, there is £6 billion worth of overpayments and fraud down to universal credit. Now that's a rise from 1.7 billion the year before, and a rise from 0.7 billion the year before that. I mean, it's staggering figures here. And what they should be doing is engaging with landlords, because the landlord can actually protect a lot of these things from happening. Because under housing benefit, the landlord was what they call a person affected. They had rights, but they also had obligations to inform the DWP or the councils when a change of circumstances took place, like somebody leaving a property, somebody who has went into hospital for a period of time. These were all things that landlords could actually engage with the council. But DWP doesn't now, because they expect what they call explicit consent to be given before they'll even communicate with the landlord. So there's a whole range of things like that. If DWP would address these issues, I think it would remove a lot of the uncertainty that exists just now. And doing what they're doing in Northern Ireland, where they have the default position of paying the landlord for at least a period of time during COVID, would have been a good idea as far as I'm concerned. But to not do that, and to basically have a policy that is designed as trust and protect, where effectively they are saying we'll accept what the tenant's saying as opposed to what the landlord's saying. Now, if you want to validate how much the tenant has actually been charged for rent, surely it's better to go to the landlord, write to the landlords as you're required to do under the regulations, and they will confirm that to you rather than rely on the tenants, because by their own admission, they are now saying that a lot of the fraud that's taking place, particularly in the kind of London and Birmingham areas, is down to tenants exaggerating the extent of their rent liabilities, creating AST agreements from downloading documents from the internet rather than asking the landlord, could you validate your tenant? So there's a whole range of things like that, simple things that could be introduced very quickly that would remove a lot of that uncertainty.
Right. Thanks, Bill. So, I mean, I think what you're painting a picture there of, what seems to be emerging is that some of the big challenges are linking in with the benefit system. The problems that landlords perceive that they face may not be with the tenants themselves. It may be the difficulty the tenants are having working within the benefit system. If we could bring in Richard as a real life landlord, there clearly are perceptions. This came out, I think, in the research that the Centre for Homelessness Impact has done, that there's going to be problems with tenancies with families on universal credit. What we're hearing, Richard, here is it may be that it's the benefit system itself which is the biggest challenge. What's the perspective of landlords? Is it tenants, or is it the benefit system that needs to be managed more effectively?
We absolutely have a benefit system that deters landlords. And when direct payments to tenants were introduced, I think around 2008, about 50% of landlords were open to letting to tenants on benefits. That's fallen to 19% now. And in London, it's as low as 7%. And we had, of course, LHA rates came down to the 30th percentile in 2011. There was the shared accommodation rate was upped to age 35 in 2012. We had the introduction of the welfare cap. And then, of course, we lost the link between LHA rates and market rents. And then those rates were frozen for 5 years. So they completely lost their connection with market rents. And what we're finding is that landlords who have tenants on universal credit, 66% of those are in arrears. So these are all huge deterrents for landlords. And I think, it's important that we remember that once upon a time, landlords were very keen to let to tenants on benefits. They saw them as tenants that would stay long term. They would often get the rent paid directly from the DWP. But I think this research is very interesting. I'm particularly interested that it points out the benefits of rent guarantee. And in many ways, that's an improvement on direct payments to landlords from the DWP, because as Bill's just explained, dealing with the DWP can be, really difficult and a deterrent in its own right. Sue mentioned incentive payments, which are of course important, and they can make up in areas like London and the South East for the fact that LHA rates are lower than market rents. But many local authorities are not good at their messaging to landlords. They need to explain that the incentive payment is part of the package, and that if you factored that over the 3 or 5 years of the lease, that it does, in a sense, make the rent higher. What the NRLA are campaigning for is, first of all, for LHA rates to be retained at the 30th percentile and increased, if possible, back to the 50th percentile, which is where they were originally. We'd also like to see a better use of long lease schemes from local authorities, and we suggest one that is a fully managed one by the local authority, but another that allows the landlord to manage the tenancy themselves. And we're also concerned about this loan that a lot of universal credits claimants begin their kind of UC journey with, and we'd like that loan to be converted into a grant. The other issue I think that anecdotally stands out a lot for me is the kind of stereotype that tenants on benefits may be harder to manage, may not look after the property. So although the research suggests that tenancy training is not an issue, certainly anecdotally it is, from what I hear from landlords at all of the landlord forums that I attend. They're really keen that tenants do get some understanding of how to manage a tenancy. So I would probably put that a bit higher up my list of priorities. And finally, I think it's really important we don't go with a narrative of rising rents. Rents have risen below the rate of inflation consistently over decades. And it's not about rising rents, it's about faults with the benefit system that makes this situation really not fit for purpose.
Right. Okay. So thanks very much, Richard. So there you've outlined, as have others, some of the kind of the big challenges around the benefit system and things which aren't in our gift to change right now. But for landlords that are watching this now, do you think that there is a better business opportunity than they perhaps realise, that if they're prepared to deal with some of the complexities, that it is an opportunity rather than something to stay well clear of?
Oh, it's tricky because, of course, whilst there's a supply of working tenants, particularly in London and the South East, who will pay market rents, why on earth would a landlord want to take tenants on benefits? That's, one of the main challenges, I think, in London and the South East. So I think it's really about persuasion and also some financial incentives that help make the business model work for landlords. I mean, in many cases, we're just talking about the business model just not working because, if you're only getting paid LHA rates, then that may not cover the mortgage and maintenance costs that the landlord seeks to cover. It's a different picture, of course, outside of London and the South East, but I think there's a lot of persuasion to be done. Unfortunately, it's a very uphill task. I had a meeting with Newham yesterday, and the officer who's been there for some 15 years, I think, is really, really struggling to get landlords to take up the leasing scheme. And the task is bigger than him, really, because it's about persuading the whole community and providing the right kind of financial incentives.
Excellent. Okay, thanks very much, Richard. Well, I think that suggests we should go back to Leisure, because the research that you commissioned was carried out by the Behavioural Insights Unit, who sometimes known as the Nudge Unit. They're absolutely about finding things that will persuade behaviour change in a positive way. So, Ligia, based on what you've heard, in particular that point that Rich has just made about there's a persuasion dimension to this. There's maybe some policy change, but there's also a potential opportunity to persuade landlords. Where should we go from here? Should we be optimistic about being able to find a way to form partnerships with landlords to enable them to access this market more, feeling less at risk?
I very much agree with what's been said, and in particular, that reality that the perception challenge is gigantic and not to be underestimated. And this is precisely where we think the types of experiments that we're designing with VIT, can really help, because this is just the beginning, the work we've done so far. And how do we get across the simple fact that, for instance, we know from recent surveys that 95% of respondents, were not behind with their rent, even though they were on benefits. How do we get that across to landlords? So I do think there's a huge amount of scope to make sure that all the myths that often come up, whether your mortgage lender won't let you let to people on housing benefit, or your insurance company won't allow you to do so, or that people fall behind with their rent. There's a huge amount of scope to do experiments to help present that information in objective ways and in ways that landlords will trust, because trust is really key. But the facts really say that a lot of the time people do not fall behind with their rents. So we need to really maximize on that. We also need to be, I suppose, more granular in terms of the strategies we deploy. So for instance, Richard, you mentioned about tenancy training, but it's not that it's not effective, it's just in relation to financial incentives. The reality is it's just not as much of an incentive as other techniques. Also, there's a question for us at the center as to whether most people actually need tenancy training, whether actually a lot of the time they're perfectly good tenants, they just don't have enough money. So again, being quite granular as to how you target different groups of people. So yes, I'll leave it there, but definitely the perception challenge is one of the most important things we can do, and working closely with landlords to really understand how we might prioritize their needs.
Yeah, thanks, Ligia. And I think in your opening remarks, you made the point that particularly in London, this is there are going to be more families who need housing, and that's their only issue. They may be new to the benefit system. So landlords may need to think about that as an opportunity or a necessity. Sue, perhaps you could reflect on our own experience of talking day to landlords to do that persuasion job. What works, and whether you're optimistic about the ability to form more partnerships with private landlords.
Well, certainly, based on our experience, we have increase the number of landlords we work with, and we have now landlords who have properties across London, so not huge portfolio landlords, but they do have more than one property, and indeed agents, and it's working for them because, and I think Ligia's absolutely right, trust is critical. If we say we're going to do something, they have to trust that we will do that. And my tenancy sustainment team work really hard to make sure any benefits that are owed to tenants are paid, so that even if there are arrears, there's a conversation going on with the landlords. They understand it's not a black hole. That's a really important thing. They understand the process, they understand where we're at, and that they'll get the money eventually. So the tenancy sustainment team have recouped something in the region to £250,000 in the last 3 months on behalf of something in the region of 100 tenants, to pay back to the landlords. So we've got case studies now, I think, and I agree with Ligia. Information is really helpful at a strategic level, but then you have to get to granular information and evidence at a granular level of what works. for us, one of the key things is making sure that our council partners who are identifying tenants to go into the properties we procure can actually afford the rent, because there is this issue about affordability, particularly for benefit capped families. And more families were put into the benefit cap as a consequence of the LHA change back in April 2020, responding to the COVID issues. So putting somebody in a tenancy that they can't afford is not fair on anybody. It's not fair on the landlord. It's not fair on the tenant, because it immediately puts them in a difficult position. So the key to a lot of this is ensuring there's a robust affordability assessment done up front. So the landlord, again, is confident that the tenant has the income, whether it is benefit, or in many cases, we do have people who are working, or quite a lot of people are working, but they might have a mix of benefit and work. As long as it can be shown that they can afford the rent, and that we're then as the safety net to make sure it works, with evidence of cases from before where it has worked. I think that is perhaps some of the persuasion and the trust element that Lydia is referring to. But it's critical that we don't set people up to fail. That's the starting point of all of this, because it's not fair on anybody otherwise.
Okay, thanks, Sue. Just if I could bring you in, Bill, briefly, just from your experience of advising landlords operating in the universal credit space, what is it they do that makes them successful?
Well, I mean, all my landlord clients are invested in this area. I think this year they're predicting something like £12 billion paid out in LHA rates. So the amount of money that's actually invested in this area is actually very, very high. The problem is that some of that money is not going to the right individuals, and that's the landlords in many cases losing out. The benefits cap is a big issue in London, no doubts about it. There are many instances in London where even doing all the things that Sue has said, you're crippled by this benefits cap because it's never been raised since 2013. And you're single young man, you're single young woman trying to get a house in London is difficult, particularly where you're not protected from the benefits cap. There are exceptions to that. And one of my clients who operates in the London area, who does take in very vulnerable tenants, initially when it was first brought in, they were losing tens of thousands every month. And what we did was we looked at the exceptions to the rule, because not everybody is affected by the benefits cap. For example, if you're earning above £604, then you can get exemption from that. Now, that should be an automatic exemption, but some of the DWP staff who are dealing with the scheme don't understand that. So if you've got people who are well versed and get a decision that they know is wrong, then somebody like Sue's team could remedy that. And it might take a week, it might take a month or a few months to do that. But that's why it's important to have these staff. The company that I was talking about, they've actually employed ex-housing benefit officers and they've employed financial inclusion officers and people who worked in CAB and things like that, particularly to give these vulnerable tenants, the support. And again, the under 35s is a group that is affected, again, particularly in the London, the big city areas, because the amount of money they get is restricted to the shared accommodation rate. However, again, there are many exceptions to that. I mean, the people who have been in a homeless hostel for 3 months or more should get the 1-bedroom rate as opposed to the shared accommodation rate. But again, the DWP staff in many instances refuse that. And again, even with my years of experience of challenging that, and I represented the first and the upper tier tribunals, that it's very difficult sometimes for even me to get a resolution to some of these things. In fact, I've actually written to the Director General of DWP with one particular case of an Asian lady who was put into a hostel, was there for nearly a year, came out of that and into a private sector landlord situation where housing benefit was initially awarded. It was paid at the 1-bedroom rate. It was paid directly to the landlord as well, because she had come from a homeless background. And that's the rules that apply under housing benefit. She then was invited to apply for universal credit. What happened? They started paying her the shared accommodation rate and they paid it to her, and she got the money and she thought it was hers. So she actually used that money for everything other than the rent.
Right.
So just overnight like that, the
Sorry, Bill, I'm going to have to, I'm sorry to jump in, but we've got 5 minutes and I just want to get some practical advice for landlords before we leave. So I wondered if each of the panel, and I'll come back to, I'll come back to you, Bill, last, and then I'll give Sue the last word as our host. Just one piece of practical advice. We can't change the benefit system, but what can we all do in our own worlds to improve the opportunities for landlords to provide rental properties for people on benefits? Let me go to you, Ligia, first. What would you suggest?
Look at the facts. There may be less risk involved than you might think. That would be my top tip.
Okay, excellent. Richard, what would your piece of advice to landlords who are interested in exploring these opportunities?
Well, I think to devise a business model that factors in all the sorts of stuff that Bill has been talking about, and in fact the other panelists as well, to see if you can make it work for you. I think what's also great is that landlords can work with organisations like Capital Letters. A lot of landlords are angry with their local authority because they don't like licensing or Article 4 directions that have been brought in and so on. But of course, you don't have to work with the local authority. You can work with Capital Letters. So I think that's a positive too.
Okay, great. Thanks for that plug, Richard. Bill, top tip for a landlord thinking about exploring these opportunities. What would you advise?
Education. Find out as much about the system as possible. Identify the areas that are likely to cause the difficulties, and either be skilled enough to deal with those or get someone to do that for you. That's the advice I would give.
Excellent. So it's not easy money, but there is money to be made if you understand the system.
Yeah, there's many businesses out there that are clients of mine who have thrived despite all the difficulties we have discussed. If you're willing to invest the time and effort to educate yourself and help tenants through the process and engaging with the tenants, that's definitely going to be a far better outcome than standing back hoping it'll all resolve itself.
Okay, thanks, Bill. And Sue, last word to you. What apart from obviously come and work with us, what's your top tip for landlords thinking about renting to families on benefits?
I think, as we all know, there is a massive homelessness crisis. That means there is a huge ready stream of tenants who, again, working with Capital Letters, we can assure you that we'll work with you to make sure your investment as a landlord is protected. But they're looking for good quality PRS homes so that boroughs, local authorities, can discharge their responsibilities over to us then support the tenancy and make sure the landlord gets a fair deal out of the arrangement. And I think you'll find that partnership an easier one than dealing with the local authority, because we pay fast. So incentive payments are paid within 7 working days of a tenant going in, and we're there to hold your hand through the process.
Excellent. Well, on behalf of Capital Letters, let me thank the panel, Ligia for presenting some fantastic research, Bill for his expertise in universal credit, and Richard providing a really robust landlord perspective. I think everybody's concluded that there's no easy wins here, but there are definite opportunities, and there may be a need for landlords to explore this market as we emerge from COVID. So please do get in touch with us if you'd like to discuss it further, details after this on the credits. Thank you, panelists. Thanks, Sue, for sponsoring this. And we'll see you in the real world to talk more about PRS very soon.